The morning they sold her off, her mother wore her best dress. Eleanor Voss stood at the top of the staircase in her family's Denver home and listened to the voices rise up from the parlor below like smoke, her father's booming satisfaction, her mother's tinkling relief, her two sisters laughing at something she could not quite hear. She pressed herself against the wall and made herself very still, the way she had learned to do as a child when stillness was the only armor available to her. 3 years we've tried, her father was saying. 3 years of apologies and explanations and turning away decent men who took one look at her mouth and walked out the door. Thomas Corwin from the bank, her mother began. Gone. Aldridge from the mill. Gone. Even young Peterson, God rest his patience, lasted exactly one dinner before she started in on his business practices. Her father's voice held a particular species of exhaustion she had grown up inside of. But Callum Ridge is different. Ridge doesn't want a decorative wife. He wants someone who can hold a ranch together while he's out working the mountain lines. He asked specifically for a woman with a strong character. He asked for difficult, her sister Cecily said, and the laughter that followed was not unkind in the way that laughter between people who love each other can still wound the person who stands outside it. It was simply honest. He wants difficult because difficult is all that's left. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the wallpaper and breathed. He's paying handsomely, her father said, and his voice had shifted now into something quieter, more private. More than any of them. I told him the truth, that she's smart as a whip and twice as sharp, and he didn't flinch. Either the man's a fool or he knows something we don't. Does it matter? Her mother asked. She'll be his problem. She'll be his problem. Eleanor walked back to her room with great care and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about crying. She thought about it the way one thinks about opening a door in a house that has always been locked, with a vague awareness that there might be something behind it but no real expectation of being allowed through. She had cried as a child. She had been told it was manipulative. She had stopped. She packed her trunk herself. The journey to Ridge Mountain took 4 days by wagon. Her father escorted her as far as the town of Harlan at the mountain's base, said something perfunctory about writing if she needed anything, and turned his horse around before she had even descended from the wagon seat. She watched him go with the particular stillness that had become her most intimate companion, and then turned to look at the road ahead. A man was waiting with a second horse. He was not what she had assembled in her imagination during the 4-day journey, during which she had constructed a version of Callum Ridge from parts available to her. The reclusive men her father did business with, the cold-eyed ranchers who came through Denver to sell cattle and disappeared again into the mountains like weather. She had prepared herself for someone large and loud with money's particular arrogance. He was large, yes, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of lean, weathered build that comes from decades of outdoor work rather than the soft bulk of prosperity. But he was standing at a slight distance from the wagon with his hat in his hands, and he was watching her descend with an expression she could not immediately name, not the appraising look she had expected, not the proprietary assessment of a man who has just made a purchase. Something quieter, something almost careful. Miss Voss, he said. Mr. Ridge. He looked at her trunk, then at her. Long ride still ahead. We can rest in town if you need. I don't need. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. All right, then. He helped her onto the horse without ceremony and did not linger in the helping, did not find reasons to hold her hand longer than necessary or comment on her riding. She had half expected both. She had, in fact, prepared for both. She rode beside him up the mountain road in silence and waited for him to begin the series of instructions and corrections and expectations that she had assumed would constitute the first hours of this arrangement. He didn't speak for nearly 2 miles. When he did, it was to name a hawk circling above the tree line. Redtail, he said. She's been hunting that ridge for 6 years. I know her by the way she holds the left wing. Eleanor looked up. The hawk was a dark shape against a sky the color of old pewter. How do you know it's a she? She's bigger. With raptors, the females run larger. Eleanor looked at him. He was watching the hawk and not her, and his face and profile was unreadable in the way of faces that have decided not to perform. That seems counterintuitive, she said. In most species, the male is larger. Most species aren't raptors, he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did complete the movement into something that might be called a smile, brief and restrained as the first light before a proper sunrise. She turned back to the road and thought about that. The ranch was not what she had expected either, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. Something grimmer, perhaps. Something more aggressively functional. What she found instead, as they crested the final ridge and the valley opened below them, was a property that bore the marks of long and genuine attention, the fences clean and well-mended, the outbuildings weathered but solid, a kitchen garden running along the south side of the main house that had no business being as carefully tended as it was. A woman named Hester ran the house. She was 60 and compact, and looked at Eleanor with frank assessment that held no hostility, only the efficiency of someone who does not have time for pretense. She showed Eleanor to her room, a real room, with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that someone had made with patience, and told her supper was at 6 and breakfast at 5:30, and that she would not be expected to work the house until she had found her footing. "Mr. Ridge's instructions," Hester said, and then left. Eleanor stood in the center of the room and turned slowly and looked at everything. She had brought 3 books in her trunk. She had assumed she would have a great deal of time for reading, the way prisoners do. At supper, which was simple and well-cooked, Callum Ridge sat across from her at a table built for 6 and asked her if she had any questions about the property. She had been saving this question, in fact, turning it over during the hours since their arrival. "You have a kitchen garden," she said. He waited. "You have a kitchen garden and a root cellar and a smokehouse and what looks like a fairly sophisticated water management system for the upper fields. This is a cattle operation." "It is." "So either you planned for this ranch to be largely self-sufficient or someone—" She stopped. "Reframed. You planned to be here a long time." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man formulating an evasion, but the silence of a man deciding how honest to be. "I plan to stay," he said finally. "This mountain is where I intend to be. Everything else I built around that fact. And a wife figures into that plan. Someone to run the house while I work the mountain lines. That's what I told your father." "Is that what you actually meant?" The candlelight between them was steady in the absence of any draft. He looked at her across it with those careful, unreadable eyes and said, "I meant something more than that." She waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. She found, to her mild surprise, that she didn't entirely mind. After supper, he showed her the ranch in the last hour of light. The cattle operation was substantial, 300 head on the lower pastures, more running the upper summer range. He had 3 hands who worked the property and a seasonal crew for roundup. He explained the water system, which was indeed sophisticated, fed by a mountain spring through a series of channels he had dug himself over the course of 5 years. He explained it without condescension, the way one professional explains a system to another, and she found herself asking questions that he answered with evident respect for the questions themselves. At the end of the tour, standing at the fence of the horse paddock in the blue dusk, he said, "I want to tell you something before we go any further." She braced in the practiced way. "I'm not going to pay your father the bride price." She turned to look at him. "I agreed to the arrangement," he said, "but I won't pay a price for a person." I told him so. He was, a pause, unhappy, but he agreed to send you regardless because he wanted you gone and I was willing to take you. He said it plainly without cruelty, the way you say a true thing that is also a hard thing. "I want you to know that you are not a transaction. Whatever happens here, that's not what this is." Eleanor looked at the horses moving in the dusk and tried to identify what she was feeling. It was not what she had expected to feel. It was something closer to the dangerous end of gratitude, which she had learned long ago to treat with suspicion. "You said whatever happens here," she said. "I did." "What does that mean?" He turned to lean his forearms on the fence rail, looking out at the horses rather than at her. "It means I want to offer you a choice. Stay 1 month, work the ranch, see the life, decide if it's something you can want. At the end of the month, if you want to leave, I'll give you a horse and enough money to go somewhere that isn't your father's house." He paused. "I'll write you a letter of reference. There are women running boarding houses, millinery shops. You'd manage something like that well." She stared at his profile. "And if I stay?" "Then you stay because you chose to." The horses moved through the dusk like dark water. Somewhere above them on the mountain, something called a nightbird, low and repeating. Eleanor had never in her life been offered a choice that was actually a choice, and the sensation of it was so foreign that she spent a long moment simply sitting with it, the way you sit with an unexpected warmth. "Why me?" she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you remember Harlan?" 3 years ago?" She blinked. "I've never been to Harlan." "The town before Harlan. Millbrook. You came through with your family on the way to your aunt's property." He paused. "There was a merchant." He was cheating a man who worked his store. An older man. Garfield was his name. This merchant had shorted his wages 3 months running and was telling anyone who asked that Garfield was stealing from inventory to cover the difference. Eleanor had gone very still. "You were walking past with your mother and sisters," Callum said, "and you stopped. You made your mother keep walking. You went into that store and you stood in front of 20 people and you took apart every one of that merchant's claims, one by one, with specifics. You knew the price of the inventory. You knew the wage rates. I don't know how you knew. I'd been in that store the day before," she said quietly. "I'd seen the ledger on the counter. I remember numbers. 20 people standing there, and not one of them had said a word." He paused again. "I was one of them." She turned to look at him fully. He was still looking at the horses. "I've thought about that for 3 years," he said. "About why you stopped when none of the rest of us did. About what kind of person does that?" She didn't know what to say. She had not thought about Millbrook in 3 years, or rather, she had, but the way you think about something painful. Her mother had not spoken to her for 2 days afterward. Her father had written a letter to the aunt explaining that Eleanor had caused a scene. She had filed it away in the long archive of things she had done that she could not make herself regret. "You waited 3 years," she said. "I made inquiries, found out who your family was, heard you were unmarried." He glanced at her sideways, and there was something in that glance that was the closest thing to self-consciousness she had yet seen in him. "It took me a while to figure out what to do with the information." She looked at him for a long moment. The night bird called again from somewhere up the dark mountain. "I'll stay the month," she said. She lasted 3 days before she found the thing that needed fixing. It was the accounting. Hester showed her the household ledgers on the second day, matter-of-factly, the way you show someone where the tools are kept, and Eleanor spent the 3rd morning going through them with the focused attention she had always given to numbers, which were reliable in ways that people frequently were not. By afternoon, she had found 2 systematic errors in the feed supply ordering that had been costing the operation money for at least 2 years. Not through dishonesty, but through the kind of small imprecision that compounds quietly over time. She brought this to Callum Ridge at supper, laid it out the way she had laid out the merchant's lies in Millbrook. Clearly, specifically, without apology for knowing what she knew. She half expected the response she had learned to expect. Some version of the polite, closed face that men got when a woman showed them something true that they had missed. He listened to every word. He looked at the figures. He looked at her. "How long did that take you?" he said. "1 morning." He nodded slowly. "Tell me what you'd change." She told him. He asked 2 good questions, incorporated the answers, and said he'd speak to the supplier the next week. Then he passed her the bread and asked Hester about the smokehouse ventilation problem, and that was that. She lay awake that night longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of her east-facing room, listening to the mountain. The days that followed built on each other with the slow accumulation of stone. She learned the ranch the way she learned most things, by paying the kind of attention that other people found excessive, and discovered that her particular brand of attention was not excessive here, but necessary. The mountain had its own logic, the way the upper pasture drained after rain and which fence lines were vulnerable in the spring melt, the moods of the 3 ranch hands, steady, younger, taciturn in that order, the places where the cattle liked to drift in the afternoon heat and where they could become stuck. She observed. She remembered. She began quietly to help. Callum Ridge noticed. She could see him noticing in the way he had of watching things. The hawk on the ridge, the cattle's drift patterns, her, with that careful attention that did not announce itself. He never praised her in the excessive way that felt like its own species of condescension. He responded to what she did the way he responded to rain or good fence, with straightforward acknowledgement and the next logical action. On the 8th day, she helped pull a calf that had gotten itself stuck in the mud of the lower creek crossing. It was ugly, necessary work, and she was in it before she thought about her dress, and by the time she thought about her dress, it was already irrelevant. Callum arrived at a gallop, took in the situation, and dropped from his horse and into the mud beside her without comment, and they worked the calf free together in the messy, specific way that real work operates, speaking only when speech was necessary, which wasn't often. When it was done, and the calf was unsteadily finding its legs on solid ground and they were both covered in creek mud to the elbow, he looked at her and said, "You're not squeamish." "No," she agreed. "Good," he said, and walked back to his horse. She stood in the mud-slicked creek bank and felt something she did not have an immediate name for. It settled in her chest like heat from a fire, not sudden or dramatic, but steady, the kind of warmth you only notice when you realize you've been cold for a very long time. At night after supper, they had taken to sitting on the porch in the last of the light. It had happened without arrangement. She had stepped outside one evening to watch the sunset over the lower valley, and he had come out a few minutes later and sat in the other chair, and they had watched the color leave the sky in companionable silence. It happened again the next evening, and the next. They talked sometimes, about the ranch, about books. He had a shelf of them, dog-eared and well-used, which surprised her and then, on reflection, didn't. About the history of the mountain, about things she had read that she had never previously had anyone to discuss. He was not a man who talked to fill space, and she had spent enough of her life surrounded by people who did that. She found the absence of it restful in a way she could not fully articulate. On the 12th day, without planning to, she told him about Millbrook from her side, what she had seen in the ledger, what she had felt, standing in that store, watching a man be publicly humiliated while the world arranged itself into a ring of silent onlookers. The specific quality of rage that had moved through her, not hot, but cold, the kind that clarifies. He listened the way he always listened, without interruption. "My mother didn't speak to me for 2 days," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "How?" "I stayed in Millbrook 2 more days after your family left." "Asked around." He paused. The merchant closed up his business 6 months later. Everyone knew why. She had not known that. She absorbed it in silence, and the warmth in her chest shifted, deepened, became something with more gravity to it. Something that frightened her a little with its specificity. She was 3 days from the end of her month when her father arrived. She saw the dust first, from the upper pasture where she was checking the fence line with one of the hands. By the time she rode back down, she had already identified the horse and the bearing of the rider, and something inside her assembled itself. Not the old flinching assembly, not the bracing for impact she had practiced her entire life, but something different. Something that stood up straight. Her father dismounted in the yard with the air of a man who owns the territory he enters. He had brought one of her brothers-in-law, which meant he had anticipated needing a witness, or muscle, or both. He looked at her mud-dusted riding clothes and her face gone brown from 2 weeks of mountain sun and made no effort to hide his distaste. "You look like a ranch hand," he said. "I am, more or less," she said. "What brings you up the mountain, father?" His eyes moved to the house, where Callum had appeared in the doorway. The 2 men looked at each other across the yard with the particular evaluation of men who have already decided to be enemies. "Ridge didn't pay," her father said. "I gave him 30 days, but I want the money." "He told you he wouldn't pay," Eleanor said. "He told you before I arrived. He told me he had scruples. I'm telling him that scruples don't run in this family, and I expect what I'm owed." Her father's voice was the voice she had heard her entire life, the voice that had learned, through years of practice, to make every unreasonable thing sound like simple business. "You've been here long enough. If the arrangement's not working, we'll find something else." "The arrangement is working," she said. "I'm not talking to you." "You're talking in front of me," Eleanor said, "about me, so you're talking to me." She moved to stand between her father and the porch steps, and she felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the difference between the girl who had stood at the top of those stairs in Denver, listening to herself, described as a problem to be solved, and the woman standing in this mountain yard. The difference was not rage. It was not even courage exactly. It was something simpler and harder, the knowledge of where she was standing and why. "He won't pay you because you cannot sell a person. You know this. You've always known this. The fact that you dressed it in the language of arrangements and bride prices doesn't change what it is." Her father's face did the thing it did when he encountered resistance he hadn't accounted for. The brief whitening around the mouth, the recalibration. "You sound like you've been out here too long with too much time to think." "I sound like myself," she said. "I always have. That was always the problem." He left without getting his money. She stood in the yard and watched the dust of his departure until it settled. And then she turned around, and Callum was standing on the porch steps, watching her with that careful, quiet attention, and what she saw in his face, for the first time, fully and without the restraint she had grown accustomed to reading there, was something that looked very much like pride. She had almost forgotten about him leaving when he was arrested. It was a Thursday, 3 days after her father's visit. Callum had ridden into Harlan for supplies, something he did every few weeks. By evening he hadn't returned. By the following morning, one of the ranch hands came up from town with the news. Callum Ridge was in the Harlan jail, held on a complaint of fraud filed by one Eleanor Voss of Denver. The charge was fabricated. She knew this the way she knew the feed ledger errors, with the cold clarity of someone who has been paying attention. Her father had filed a false claim, something about misrepresentation in the original arrangement, money advanced in trust, and the Harlan sheriff, who had grown up in the shadow of Denver money, had not looked too closely at the paperwork. Hester came to find her in the horse paddock, where Eleanor was already saddling a horse. "You're not going down there alone," Hester said. "Yes, I am," Eleanor said. "It'll go faster." Hester looked at her for a long moment with those frank, assessing eyes. Then she went inside and came back with a leather satchel. "The household ledgers," she said, "and the letters from the bank, and the original agreement your father signed." She handed it over. "He keeps everything. He always has." Eleanor looked at the satchel. Then she looked at Hester. "How long have you worked here?" 12 years, Hester said. "Has he ever done anything dishonest?" "Not once." Eleanor put the satchel in her saddlebag and mounted the horse, and she rode down the mountain alone in the early morning light, with the cold air off the peaks at her back and the valley opening below her, and she thought about a store in Millbrook and a man being publicly diminished while the world stood still, and she thought about a woman who had not been able to stand still then and could not stand still now, and she thought that some things about a person were not flaws, no matter how many people told you they were. Some things were just who you were. The sheriff's office in Harlan was a single-room building with a jail cell at the back. The sheriff was a soft-faced man in his 40s who looked uncomfortable in the presence of a woman who was not performing distress. Eleanor put the satchel on his desk and opened it and began to explain, in the same clear, specific, unapologetic way she had explained everything in her life that needed explaining, exactly why every item in her father's complaint was false. She had the bank letters. She had the original agreement, which her father had signed, which contained Callum's explicit written refusal to pay a bride price and her father's explicit written acceptance of those terms. She had 3 years of Harlan business records showing Callum Ridge's impeccable reputation, which she had had Hester compile before she left. The sheriff was quiet for a long time after she finished. "Your father's a Denver man," he said finally. Not accusatory, almost apologetic. "He is," Eleanor said. "And I am his daughter, which means I know exactly how he operates. That complaint is retaliation. Every document in front of you proves it." She held the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Callum Ridge has been running this mountain for 12 years without a single dispute. My father has been in this county for 4 days. I'll let you weigh those things against each other." Callum was released by midday. He walked out of the jail into the mountain sunlight and stopped when he saw her. Saw her with the horse, with the satchel, with the specific expression of a woman who has done what needed doing and is trying to make it look ordinary. He stood very still for a moment and looked at her the way he had looked at the hawk on the ridge, with complete attention, with something that had given up pretending to be anything other than what it was. "How?" he said. "Hester packed the satchel," she said. "I just did the talking." He was quiet for a moment. The mountain town moved around them. Horses, voices, the creak of a wagon, and all of it felt very far away. "You rode down alone," he said. "It was faster." "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it the way you feel the first real warmth of spring. Sudden, and then all at once obvious, as if the cold had been the aberration all along. "I wasn't going to leave you in there," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, stripped of the professional steadiness she had assembled for the sheriff's office. "I wasn't going to just—" She stopped. "I don't do that. I don't stand still when something's wrong." "I know," he said. "I know you don't." He looked at her for a long moment with everything he had been careful about for 12 days, and then 3 years before that, and then he crossed the space between them and took her hands, both of them, in his. And the gesture was not dramatic. It was not the gesture of a man performing feeling for an audience. It was simple and specific, and it held her hands the way you hold something you have been waiting to hold for a very long time. "Your month is up in 3 days," he said. "I know. I'd like you to stay." She looked at their hands, and then at his face, and at everything in it that was honest and careful and quietly, completely certain. She thought about east-facing windows and kitchen gardens and hawks that hold the left wing differently. She thought about the way silence could be a kind of generosity offered by someone who understood that not all noise needed to be filled. She thought about the moment in the mud of the creek crossing when she had realized she had been cold for a very long time. "I wasn't planning to go," she said. They were married on the ranch on a Wednesday in September because Wednesday was a quiet day and there was no reason to make it louder than it needed to be. Hester made a cake. The three ranch hands stood in the yard in their good shirts. The circuit preacher from Harlan said the words, which were the same words he always said, and which Eleanor listened to with the attention she gave to everything, finding in them, to her mild surprise, a few that seemed true. There were no families present. Her father had not been invited. Callum had no family living, which he had mentioned once, briefly, in a way that indicated it had been a fact long enough that it had lost most of its edges. Afterward, standing on the porch in the late afternoon light with a piece of Hester's cake and the valley laid out below them in the long gold of autumn, he said, "You're thinking something." "I'm always thinking something." "What is it?" She looked at the valley for a moment, at the fence lines clean and well-mended, the cattle moving in the lower pasture, the kitchen garden gone to its autumn colors, the mountain above all of it with its red-tail hawk tracing slow circles on the thermal. She thought about a girl at the top of a staircase hearing herself described as a problem. She thought about the specific word her sister had used, which had been accurate, which had always been accurate, which she had spent her whole life trying to make herself smaller to accommodate and could not, because some things are not reducible. "I think I've been looking for somewhere I fit," she said, without knowing that's what I was looking for. Callum was quiet for a moment, and then he said, the way he always said things that mattered, simply, without decoration, "You fit here." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley with that steady, patient attention, and she understood something about him that she had been assembling for a month without quite finishing the picture, that he had built all of this, the self-sufficient ranch, the careful water system, the 12 years of solitary attention to a mountain, not because he wanted to be alone, but because he had been waiting for something specific. Someone specific. Someone who would not flinch from the mud or the numbers or the things that needed saying. Someone who would ride down a mountain alone if it needed doing. "I know," she said. "I know I do." The hawk made one more circle above the ridge, riding the thermal in that particular tilted way. Left wing, always the left, and then banked south into the last of the light, and was gone. Below them, the ranch held its ground in the quiet mountain evening, solid and real and hers, and Eleanor Voss, who was Eleanor Ridge now, and who had always been exactly this, difficult and sharp and incapable of standing still when something was wrong, stood on her porch in the long gold of September and understood for the first time the sensation of belonging somewhere so completely that the somewhere felt like it had been waiting for her too.